Before the 20th century, hospitals were designed to heal you without medicine. And then, almost all of them disappeared. Hospitals were not simply places where people were treated, they were environments, carefully constructed spaces where recovery was expected to happen as a natural process. Architecture itself was part of medicine, where light, air, and spatial design were not secondary features, but central elements of healing. Yet, almost suddenly, this entire approach disappears and is replaced by something fundamentally different, something more controlled, more enclosed, more standardized. The official explanation tells us that this was simply progress, that medicine evolved, that science improved, that outdated systems were replaced by better ones. On the surface, this explanation seems complete, logical, and even obvious. But the more closely you look at the timing, the scale, and the uniformity of this transition, the more it raises questions, because what we're looking at does not feel like a slow evolution. It doesn't feel like a gradual improvement built over generations. Instead, it looks abrupt, coordinated in outcome if not in intent, and surprisingly consistent across different parts of the world that were not directly connected in terms of policy or culture at the time. That's where the story becomes less straightforward. History. A closer look at 19th century hospital designs. If we go back to the 19th century, we find that hospitals across Europe, North America, and even parts of Asia share a remarkably similar design philosophy, one that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. These buildings were often constructed using what is known as the pavilion model, long, extended wings spreading outward from a central structure, with significant spacing between them. High ceilings were designed to allow air to circulate freely, and tall windows were positioned to maximize sunlight exposure throughout the day. The overall emphasis was on openness rather than confinement. Patients were not concentrated into dense, enclosed units, but were instead distributed across space. And this wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was intentional. It reflected a belief that healing wasn't only about direct intervention, but about creating the right conditions for the body to recover. Conditions that included clean air, natural light, and minimal stagnation. What makes this more interesting is that this approach appears across multiple countries with very little variation in principle. In England, large hospital complexes followed this exact logic. In the United States, similar structures were built with almost identical layouts. In Switzerland and Germany, entire sanatorium systems expanded on these ideas, focusing heavily on sunlight exposure and fresh air, often placing patients on open balconies or terraces for extended periods. Even in Eastern Europe, we see similar architectural decisions, suggesting that this wasn't a local trend, but a widespread understanding. This level of consistency typically implies either shared knowledge or shared necessity. Despite how dominant this model was, however, it doesn't gradually evolve into modern hospitals. Instead, it disappears, and it does so within a relatively short historical window. The transition to new hospital designs. By the early 20th century, the design of hospitals began to shift in ways that were not subtle. The extended wings started to shrink or vanish entirely. Buildings became more compact, more centralized, and more vertically organized. Interiors became segmented into smaller, controlled spaces rather than large open wards. Ventilation shifted from natural to mechanical, and the entire philosophy of design turned inward, away from the environment and toward internal systems. This change happened faster than one would expect for something so fundamental. Architecture on this scale doesn't typically transform overnight. It requires planning, resources, and agreement across institutions. Yet within a few decades, the dominant model of hospital design was almost completely replaced. This raises a critical question. If the previous system was so widespread, so consistent, and so intentionally designed, why was it abandoned so quickly rather than adapted or improved? The influence of scientific advancements. The standard explanation points to scientific advancement, particularly the rise of germ theory, the understanding that microorganisms cause disease. This led to an increased emphasis on sterilization, isolation, and controlled environments. It's often presented as the turning point that made older hospital designs obsolete because open airflow could theoretically spread pathogens and enclosed, controlled spaces allowed for better containment. Again, this explanation is not without merit. It aligns with what we know about infection control. But it doesn't fully explain the scale and speed of the transition. Even with modern medical knowledge, we still recognize the importance of environmental factors. We know that natural light affects hormonal balance and circadian rhythms. We know that air quality impacts respiratory function and recovery rates. We know that physical space influences stress, immunity, and overall well-being. So the question isn't whether these factors matter, but why they were deprioritized so drastically. Why was a system that was built around them not integrated into the new model, but instead largely removed? The growth of the pharmaceutical industry and centralized medicine. During this same period, medical education became increasingly centralized. Institutions began to define and regulate what was considered valid knowledge. Practices that fell outside of these frameworks began to disappear, not necessarily because they were proven ineffective, but because they were no longer included in the system. As medicine became more structured, more protocol-driven, and more measurable, it also became more scalable. With scalability came the ability to expand, to standardize, and to monetize. Pharmaceutical industries began to grow rapidly. Medical technologies became specialized, and treatments became standardized procedures that could be applied across institutions. Older approaches, particularly those that relied on environmental variation, individualized conditions, or less quantifiable factors, became increasingly difficult to integrate into this system. Not because they couldn't exist, but because they couldn't be easily measured, controlled, or replicated at scale. As a result, they began to fade, gradually at first, then more completely. Observations about the disappearance of old hospitals and their designs. And then there are the buildings themselves, the ones that remain. Many former hospitals, sanatoriums, and medical complexes from the 19th century no longer serve their original purpose. Some have been demolished, others repurposed into hotels, schools, or administrative buildings, and others left abandoned. When you examine their layouts, certain features stand out: large open terraces, unusual spatial arrangements, orientation that prioritizes sunlight over efficiency, and design choices that do not always align with modern medical logic. Almost as if they were built according to a different set of assumptions about how healing works. This leads to further speculation. Some researchers propose that these buildings may have been designed with a deeper awareness of environmental effects on the human body, including factors not fully emphasized in modern medicine, such as continuous exposure to natural elements, subtle interactions between structure and physiology, or even concepts that do not easily fit into current scientific frameworks, such as ideas related to resonance or frequency. I'm not saying these theories are correct, but they attempt to address a gap in the explanation because the disappearance of a globally consistent system without a gradual transition is not easy to account for. Summary of the main points. So instead of drawing conclusions, it may be more useful to focus on the questions that remain because they highlight what we do not yet fully understand. Why were so many hospitals built before 1900 demolished, repurposed, or fundamentally altered rather than adapted? Why do their designs differ so significantly from those that replaced them? Why do environmental factors once considered central to healing and later treated as secondary? Why did this transition occur across multiple continents within such a narrow framework? Why do we observe similar architectural principles appearing globally and then disappearing almost simultaneously? What determined which medical approaches were retained and which were excluded? And if this was simply progress, why doesn't it follow the gradual, cumulative pattern that progress usually takes? Perhaps the most important question of all, if something was replaced rather than evolved, what exactly was lost? And is it possible that we are only now beginning to notice its absence?